This is part 2 of our lecture video on the endocrine system. We talked last time about the posterior pituitary and how it's controlled by the hypothalamus and that it secretes the hormones ADH and oxytocin. And remember that the posterior pituitary is just simply an extension of the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary is made up of axons, it's made up of nervous tissue. Anterior pituitary is a true endocrine gland, and it secretes hormones, several hormones, still under the control of the hypothalamus, but it's true endocrine tissue, and it secretes and makes those hormones and secretes them to the blood. So some of the hormones from the anterior pituitary control other glands of the endocrine system, and we call any hormone that controls another endocrine gland, we call that a tropic hormone. So you'll see that word in a couple of these hormones we're going to talk about. So the anterior pituitary releases thyroid stimulating hormone. So when this hormone, TSH, enters the blood, it binds to receptors on the thyroid and tells that thyroid to start making its hormones, which it's going to secrete to the bloodstream. So the only organ with receptors for TSH are going to be that thyroid hormone to make the thyroid hormones that will be distributed throughout the rest of the body. Adrenocorticotropic hormones, it's kind of a long word, but you can see the suffix in this word is adreno, or the root word is adreno. So this hormone binds to receptors on the adrenal glands, and it tells them to produce, the adrenal glands tells them to produce the hormone cortisol. And cortisol is a hormone that is part of our long-term stress response. People that have long-term stress have increased levels of cortisol in the body, and that has a number of effects on the body. It suppresses the immune system, it causes fat deposition around the midsection, and over the long term it can be unhealthy to have high levels of cortisol. So that's something that we need to control, is our stress. And maybe you've heard of cortisone before, like if you've ever had a swollen joint, you might get a hydrocortisone shot in that joint. Cortisol is also a powerful anti-inflammatory. So it's useful in that sense, but it has other side effects that we don't like to be on those hormones for a long period of time. Cortisol is classified as a steroid hormone based on its chemical structure, and we know that steroids are not healthy for the body in high concentrations. Gonadotropic hormones, gonads, those refer to the ovaries and the testes. So these are, again, tropic hormones, which means they tell another endocrine gland to secrete their hormones. So the gonadotropins from the anterior pituitary, there are two of them, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. These hormones function they act on the ovaries and testes and tell them to secrete their hormones, which would be progesterone, testosterone, and estrogen, and also development of those organs in terms of maturing an egg for ovulation or sperm production. And we'll get more into the specific functions of each of these when we study the reproductive system a little later. So again, tropic hormones are hormones that act on other endocrine glands and tell them to secrete their hormones. So we can see, we just talked about the anterior pituitary is here on this side. We can see it's made up of true cells, true endocrine cells. Remember, the posterior pituitary is just an extension of the hypothalamus. It's made up of axons. But each of these has a capillary supply that feeds it, and that's what's shown here in blue and red. So the anterior pituitary secretes thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which acts on the adrenal cortex, which is the outer layer of the adrenal gland. It also secretes prolactin, and prolactin acts on the glands of the breast to stimulate milk production. Growth hormone is another hormone, and that acts on muscle and bone and connective tissue, contributing to growth in the body, particularly during puberty. And then we talked about FSH and LH act on the ovaries and the testes. So the anterior pituitary really has a strong control over the endocrine system. But again, it's the hypothalamus up here that has ultimate control, because it's constantly sampling and deciding when to tell the anterior and pituitary to secrete their hormones. So when we look at the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary, it operates under negative feedback, which means if we have high levels of a hormone in the blood, that's going to stimulate the hypothalamus to inhibit secretion of that hormone, so we can have a constant, even level of hormone, and we don't have excess secretion. So it's constantly providing feedback to the anterior pituitary on whether more hormone secretion is necessary or whether it should be inhibited while that hormone is active in the blood. So negative feedback, again, is a balancing homeostatic mechanism where if a level gets too high, the body responds by decreasing that level of production, and vice versa. If a hormone level is too low in the blood, the hypothalamus would stimulate the anterior or the posterior pituitary gland to increase the level of that hormone in the blood, depending on what hormone that it is. So just kind of reviewing some of these again. So the anterior pituitary releases prolactin that causes milk production. It also releases a hormone called melanocyte stimulating hormone. It causes skin color changes in animals, but not in humans. So I'm not going to hold anyone accountable for this particular hormone. It's just worth mentioning, but it's not something that we see that has a strong component in humans. Growth hormone. It promotes skeletal and muscular growth. It's very active, like I said, during childhood and development, and also stimulates production of a growth factor by the liver, which further contributes to growth. Sometimes we see overproduction of growth hormone during childhood, leading to gigantism, and then too little is called pituitary dwarfism. And sometimes growth hormone, due to a tumor on the pituitary gland, increases after puberty is complete, and that doesn't increase the height of the individual because the growth plates are fused and done growing, but that excess growth hormone after puberty results in large feet and hands and face, because those areas have not necessarily had the fusion of growth plates, and that can cause increased growth in those areas. So here we can see an example of gigantism, and here is the pituitary dwarfism. That's different than the dwarfism we talked about, that is a chromosomal disorder, but that's dwarfism. And looking at the acromegaly, this would be a normal hand, and then after too much growth hormone, again, would be a tumor on the pituitary gland causing excess growth hormone secretion. We can see how the bones in his hand have increased in size, and again, we call that acromegaly. The thyroid gland is in charge of metabolism and also plays a role in calcium homeostasis. Calcium is an important part of nerve and muscle function, so when calcium levels are too high or too low, the thyroid gland will respond. So calcitonin is a hormone released by the thyroid gland, and the job of calcitonin is to remove calcium from the blood and deposit it in bone. So that's an important hormone for saving our bone and preventing osteoporosis, although it plays a small role in bone maintenance, but it is important nonetheless. And people with osteoporosis take a medicine that acts like calcitonin and promotes bone formation, so those people don't have excess bone loss and fractures. So the thyroid gland, number one role is metabolism, so keeping your body at the right level of activity. People with excess thyroid secretion will have hyperthyroidism, and they might feel sweaty and stressed out and hungry because they have an overactive metabolism. And those with not enough thyroid hormone will end up with hypothyroidism and feel tired, and have dry skin, have weight gain, and all of that's all because of a low metabolism, because not enough thyroid hormones are being secreted. So anytime we have a goiter, that's an increase in the size of the thyroid gland. And a couple of pictures here. This is an example of a goiter, and we know that it's important for us to get enough vitamin C in our diet. So vitamin C and iodine are two important components of our diet, and people that don't get enough iodine can end up with a goiter. So we see this more in third world countries where there's not good access to nutrient-rich food. So some babies are born with an underactive thyroid, and they have to make sure that they get supplemental thyroid. Otherwise, it could have permanent effects and slow brain development. And when people have low thyroid hormone as adults, like I said, it can cause weight gain, feeling cold all the time, tired, loss of hair, slower heart rate. So again, we would need to replace those hormones, and that condition is called myxedema when people have low thyroidism or low thyroid hormone during adulthood. So if that thyroid gland is overactivated, either by a tumor on the anterior pituitary or cancer of the thyroid, we can see excess hormone production, and it causes hyperactivity, nervousness, irritability, and it would need to be removed or destroyed by radioactive iodine to get that hormone production of the thyroid under control. And we talked about calcium, like I said, is an important ion for bone homeostasis and keeping our bones, bone mass high and preventing fractures. So calcitonin is a hormone released by the thyroid gland, and its job is to deposit calcium into our bones so we have good bone mass, and that is important for, again, preventing osteoporosis. 4 small swellings on the thyroid gland are the parathyroid glands, and their job is to secrete parathyroid hormone, which does the opposite of calcitonin. It promotes osteoclast activity, which breaks down bone and releases calcium to the blood. So if we don't get enough calcium in our diet, that's going to result in an increase in parathyroid hormone secretion, so we can get enough calcium in our blood. So it's important that we get enough calcium in our diet so we don't have excess secretion of parathyroid hormone, because that would lead to, again, osteoporosis. So hypoparathyroidism would cause a drop in blood calcium because there isn't enough hormone to release the calcium to the blood from the bone, and that can cause, when we have low blood calcium, that causes twitches and muscle contraction, and that condition is called tetany. And tetany is when the whole body is contracting. Maybe you've heard of tetanus. If a person doesn't get their tetanus shot, if they get the bacteria that causes tetanus in their body and it's not treated, it can cause full contraction of the body and eventually lead to death. So it's a very serious condition. Calcium is very important in our body, so we need that parathyroid hormone to break down bone and release calcium when necessary. So some people have too much secretion of PTH, and that would again cause osteoporosis because it breaks down bone to release calcium, and the excess calcium in the blood would result in kidney stones. So again, we need just the right balance of these hormones, otherwise we're going to see the health effects of that. The adrenal glands, we talked about, those sit on top of the kidney. They have 2 layers. The outer layer of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal cortex, and the inner layer is called the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal medulla has neurons that stimulate it to release epinephrine, and epinephrine is our short-term stress response hormone. It helps us to prepare for fight or flight. You might remember that when we studied the nervous system. So epinephrine causes increased heart rate and dilated airways and dilated pupils to prepare us for fight or flight in that stress response. And then the adrenal cortex is the outer layer of the adrenal gland, and that secretes corticotropin releasing hormone. Under the control of this hormone, CRH and ACTH, it releases, like I said, that hormone cortisol that we talked about for long-term stress control. So here's the adrenal gland, sits on top of the kidney. The outer layer we call the adrenal cortex, so this layer here. And the inner layer is the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal medulla secretes different hormones than the adrenal cortex does. So the adrenal medulla, like I said, is that inner portion. It secretes 2 stress hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. It allows us, to quickly respond to a fight or flight response or stimulus, and causes increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. These are medicines we have on hand in the hospital for people that have, falling blood pressure, falling heart rate. We'll give them, epinephrine, or maybe you've heard of an EpiPen that people carry if they have an allergic reaction to something they ate or a bee sting. This hormone also dilates the airways and prevents that swelling of the airways with severe allergic reactions. So the adrenal medulla is that middle part, secretes the epinephrine and norepinephrine, and the only structures that control the adrenal medulla does not have receptors for hormones. It's stimulated by neurons from the nervous system. So autonomic neurons, sympathetic neurons from the spinal cord stimulate the cells of the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine to the blood. The adrenal cortex, like I said, is the outer portion of the adrenal gland, and it secretes a number of hormones. We classify them into a broader category called glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids, but they secrete a small amount of the sex hormones. So women produce testosterone, but not from the ovaries. The testosterone comes from the adrenal cortex. And men secrete estrogen. We find estrogen in fat cells and also in the, adrenal cortex. So males and females have both sex hormones in their bodies, some more than others. So if we look at the adrenal cortex during stressful periods, it's going to release both of these classes of hormones to the blood, and they have a number of functions. They break down fat and protein for energy. They reduce inflammation. Again, that's why we use cortisone. Hydrocortisone is an artificial form of cortisol from the adrenal cortex, and we use that to reduce inflammation in people that have maybe severe asthma or a joint disorder where there's a lot of inflammation. They might get a cortisone shot there. Also causes sodium and water to be reabsorbed by the kidney, so it increases blood pressure. And so over the long term, these hormones related to long-term stress are not healthy for the body, and that's why it's important that we control our stress, because increasing our blood pressure is not always a good thing over the long term. So it's important that we control stress. So it helps repair damaged tissues with that anti-inflammatory response. So cortisol does have a good function, but again, over the long term, it's not good for overall health and homeostasis. So those hormones also raise blood sugar. So people can end up, being pre-diabetic if they have a lot of cortisol production. And we already talked about, decreasing swelling and pain from inflammation. So that is a good function of cortisone. And again, these are all coming from the adrenal cortex. Another important hormone is aldosterone from the adrenal cortex, and its job is to reabsorb sodium, which pulls water into the bloodstream, and it's good for raising blood pressure. So anytime we have a drop in blood pressure, we're going to see an increase in aldosterone production from the adrenal cortex. Renin is a hormone that's secreted by the kidneys. It works with aldosterone to raise blood pressure. Again, I'm not going to have you know anything in more detail than that. Just know that renin is produced by the kidneys, and its job is to raise blood pressure with the help of aldosterone. And another hormone, another protein that we find in the lungs and in the blood is angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2, but again, we're not going to go into the details of that for this class. This is just a hormone secreted by the kidneys, and that's renin. Another hormone that we find in the walls of the atria is atrial natriuretic hormone. The job of this hormone is to decrease blood pressure. So if blood pressure gets too high, there's increased stretch of the walls of the atria, this hormone is released and inhibits aldosterone and causes sodium to remain in the kidney and enter the urine, which causes more water to follow, and that will lower blood pressure. So this is an important hormone for lowering blood pressure, and it's called atrial natriuretic hormone. It's secreted by the cells of the atria when we have too high a blood pressure. So it's really important that we have these hormones working in our favor to constantly control our blood pressure with the help of the kidneys. So we know that the kidneys can secrete sodium and potassium and other ions, or hang on to those ions depending on the needs of the body. And it's also important for controlling our water volumes, which eventually controls blood volume and blood pressure. So these hormones work together to maintain blood pressure. And then lastly, we have the sex steroids. So those are the hormones that are released by the ovaries and the testes. So we know that estrogen is the primary female hormone and testosterone is the primary male hormone. But regardless, these hormones, again, secretion are controlled by the hormones of the anterior pituitary, FSH and LH, act on the ovaries and testes, stimulating them to produce their hormones. When we look at estrogen, for example, it's important for growth before puberty. Estrogen is what makes girls grow taller, and it maintains bone mass after puberty is complete. So we know prior to menopause, women can maintain their bone mass with the help of estrogen, but once they hit menopause, then that bone mass decreases because the estrogen no longer stimulates osteoblasts to build up the bone. The pancreas has a number of jobs. It has 3 different types of cells, 3 different hormones are secreted by the pancreas, and that is glucagon, insulin, and somatostatin. Glucagon and insulin are really important for controlling blood sugar. Glucagon raises blood sugar between meals, and insulin lowers blood sugar between meals, or after meals. And then somatostatin is a hormone that is in charge of regulating digestion, and we're not going to go into the details of that hormone. What I would like you to focus on for this body system of the endocrine system are the roles of glucagon and insulin. Again, glucagon raises blood sugar when you haven't eaten, and insulin lowers blood sugar after you have eaten. And these are clustered into small areas of the pancreas called the pancreatic islets of Langerhans, and it's these cells, these beta cells, that are destroyed when someone has type 1 diabetes and their body or pancreas no longer secretes insulin. So we'll pick up in the next video talking a little bit more about insulin and diabetes.